So this sarcomere, if you look up the definition of a sarcomere, it will say something about how this is the functional unit of muscle contraction. It's kind of like when we studied the urinary system when we had a nephron. So the sarcomere is a microscopic unit that actually functions when the muscle contracts. And I mentioned, so here's kind of a picture here of one sarcomere. Okay, so a sarcomere is from one Z line to the next Z line. So here's another Z line over here. And it's made up of thick, here's the thick myofilament, and I want you to know the name of the protein that makes up that thick myofilament is called myosin. Okay. The thin myofilament here, which is kind of strange, it actually has 3 different proteins. They're just small. So the main one is actin that will be on here. That's actually what they're showing in this picture. But then surrounding the actin are 2 regulatory proteins. Okay, one is called troponin, and the other one is called tropomyosin. And if you take a look at the top picture here, this is what sarcomeres look like when they are relaxed. So the easiest way to kind of tell this apart is if you actually look for this H zone, okay? And actually it's a little bit wider than that. It actually extends all the way from the one thin filament to the start of the neck. So this is the H zone right here. So you'll notice that space in there. That's going to tell you that the sarcomere is relaxed. Whereas you'll notice when the sarcomere on the bottom here contracts, it looks like it's one constant piece here of actin. They don't actually connect, but what they do is overlap. So it actually would look more like this. Okay, so know that when the sarcomere is contracted, that H zone disappears. Okay. Or if I give you something like this where I have a relaxed and a contracted side by side, kind of measure the distance from one Z line to the next Z line and then compare it to here. So basically the whole sarcomere shortens. So now we're going to look at how this, what we call the sliding filament model of muscle contraction, we're going to be looking at the order of this, and you're going to actually be putting this in order on your quiz. So this would be these next few slides will be very helpful in that. So we haven't studied the nervous system yet. There are 3 types of neurons, and the one that actually is in charge of carrying information to a muscle from either the brain or the spinal cord is called a motor neuron. And there is a neurotransmitter that is released from a motor neuron. It's called acetylcholine. I will be abbreviating it ACH, so that's fine for you to know as well. Acetylcholine will actually leave the motor neuron and pass into something called the synapse. It's a space in between the motor neuron. So the synaptic is referring to this space between, in this case, a neuron, a motor neuron, and in this case, a muscle. Okay, and specifically a skeletal muscle in this case. So acetylcholine will be released in that tiny little space, and it will diffuse slowly, very slowly across this little synapse, and it will actually bind to a protein receptor that's on the sarcolemma. Again, that's the plasma membrane of a muscle cell. Okay. So if we take a look at this, it looks something like this. Okay, so here's kind of the end of this motor neuron, and here these little green circles are the acetylcholine that's coming out of that motor neuron. And acetylcholine will bind, just like you can see here, to a receptor. Okay, and what that will do is it will communicate to the muscle cell that it's time to release calcium. Okay, so actually there's a fourth step that's kind of hidden into step number 3 here. So I'm just going to put that as step 3.5. You'll use step 4 on your quiz. Okay, so calcium is going to be released from that sarcoplasmic reticulum. And that released calcium will actually bind to that troponin on the thin filament. Okay, so if we look in a little closer, here's the troponin. Okay, and the problem when a muscle is relaxed is we have this tropomyosin, that's kind of that green ribbon. It's kind of woven into that actin filament, and it really covers up. You can kind of barely see. There's kind of a binding site here, here, here. You can't really see them very well because the tropomyosin is actually covering those up. However, when calcium binds, you can see the difference over here. When we have calcium present, notice it binds to the troponin, but because troponin is bound or connected to tropomyosin, it actually exposes these little binding sites on here. Okay, so that's going to be, so basically this would be, let me just go like this. So this would be step 4. This is step 5. Step 6 is where the myosin binding sites are exposed. Okay, and then actually now we're kind of caught up. And when that happens at the same time, what's called a cross bridge forms, and that's part of the myosin. Okay. Myosin on that cross bridge, so here's the myosin coming out, here's kind of this little myosin head or little myosin cross bridge. It has a little binding site on here that ATP can bind to. And so when ATP binds, it basically kind of powers or energizes that myosin cross bridge, and then something called the power stroke happens. So this is kind of putting it all together. Here you can kind of see that little myosin head or myosin cross bridge attaching to the actin, and then kind of like a golf swing, and it kind of swings through. And then again, you'll notice ATP is also required for this to relax as well. Okay, I encourage you to go to YouTube and just type in, sliding filament model, and it'll have lots of different animations of this process. So knowing that ATP is required for muscle contraction, muscle fibers can't store it. Okay, very limited amounts of ATP. So there's several different ways, several different processes that can provide ATP. One of them, we actually talked about creatine phosphate back in the urinary system. It's a quick method of recovery. Maybe after a workout, you can use supplements to supplement your creatine, and it helps you kind of recover. Just remember, we talked about how important it is to increase water intake. Because creatine will pull water from other cells and could dehydrate those cells, even leading to death in some cases. Fermentation is very fast acting, but one of the byproducts of fermentation is lactate, or you might have heard of lactic acid, and we think that that actually interferes with those cross bridge formations. And so if we can't have cross bridges, we can't contract. And so that's why fermentation is basically best for kind of quick bursts of energy. It's not designed for long-term, like endurance races or anything like that. Fermentation is used more like in a sprint. And then really what the best long-term source of ATP is cellular respiration. Okay, it's not an immediate source, so remember, we've got the carbohydrates and the fats that we eat have to really be broken down first into glucose and fatty acids and glycerol, which takes some time. So imagine, from the time you eat a meal full of carbs or healthy unsaturated fats, it's going to be, the next day before those things are actually absorbed in the small intestine. And then lastly, here are some diseases that I want you to know. Fibromyalgia does relate to the muscular system. There's still a lot that's not really well understood about fibromyalgia, but it is a real disorder. Some individuals that complain about the pain get easily frustrated because they can't find the exact cause of that fibromyalgia. But we do know that if you know somebody with this, exercise or physical therapy does help. Muscular dystrophy is a genetic disorder where basically muscles progressively degenerate. There's actually a structural protein called dystrophin that's abnormal. And so that's why their sarcomeres basically degenerate. Myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune disorder. So you can put it into the same category as lupus, type 1 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis. So basically this is a hypersensitivity where your immune system thinks that acetylcholine receptor on the sarcolemma is actually a foreign object. And it attacks it. And so when people with myasthenia gravis have usually very weak muscles of the face, the neck, and the extremities. Again, this is what we call a hypersensitivity, because the immune system is basically overreacting and thinking that this acetylcholine receptor is a foreign invader. And then the last disorder that I want you to know is ALS. It's also know the common name as well. It's also called Lou Gehrig's disease. And so we just lost Stephen Hawking this last year. This is a picture of Stephen Hawking. If you're a fan of the show Big Bang Theory, you've probably seen episodes where Stephen Hawking was on that show. This is his most famous published work, A Brief History of Time. If you want to read a pretty easy read, Mitch Albom writes a lot of fiction, but actually this is a nonfiction book about one of his college professors, Maury. So this is a true story. And Mitch Albom, when he was in college, he developed a close friendship with one of his professors who was diagnosed with ALS. And so Mitch actually would go and visit Maury every Tuesday. And so each week you kind of see how this disease actually progresses and gets worse and worse and worse. The late chapters of the book, Maury he can't eat, he can't swallow. It's just really a progressively deteriorating disorder. But this is caused by basically those motor neurons, the ones that are supposed to be telling the muscles to contract. These degenerate and die. And so as you can see with Stephen Hawking, he lost the ability to walk, lost the ability to talk. He used a computer to basically do his talking for him. And so Stephen Hawking has obviously a different form of ALS. Most individuals that are diagnosed with ALS live for about 2 years. And that's what they expected with Stephen Hawking as well. But he was in his 20s when he was diagnosed, and he lived to be a pretty old man. So obviously he had great medical care and great physical therapists and things that would actually move his muscles for him. But he must have had a different form of ALS that he lived to be so long. So that's the end of this lecture. Again, go on and take your quiz and let me know what questions you have. I'll see you Monday.